When I first heard the news that my sister had been given everything, the shock was not something that could be described in simple words. It was like my entire being froze in one moment, as if the air around me turned into glass and I was trapped inside, unable to breathe, unable to move, unable to think clearly, because the weight of that single decision was enough to crush everything I thought I knew about fairness, about family, about loyalty, about love, and suddenly the world around me did not feel like the world I had always trusted. It felt alien, hostile, filled with silent betrayals I had never noticed before, and in that moment I realized how naive I had been to believe that ties of blood were stronger than greed, to believe that my sacrifices and devotion would matter when the time came for recognition, because clearly they hadn't. Clearly they had been forgotten the way dust gathers in corners and no one cares enough to wipe it away. And as I stood there trying to process what I had been told, my mind flooded with memories of every moment I had been the one holding the family together, every night I had sat by my father's side when he was sick, every errand I had run, every compromise I had made, all while my sister lived her life untouched, distant, enjoying freedoms I never allowed myself because I believed duty was heavier than desire. But duty, I was learning now, was nothing more than a chain around my neck, one I had willingly clasped, thinking it would make me worthy, and yet worthiness meant nothing when weighed against cunning, when weighed against favoritism, when weighed against carefully spun lies that must have been whispered when I wasn't around, painting me as less deserving, less important, less valuable. And as I thought of her, of the smile she must have had when she learned she had inherited everything, a heat began to rise in me, not just anger but a kind of fire that burns deeper, the fire that comes when you realize you've been played, when the scales fall from your eyes and you finally see that you were never meant to be treated as equal, you were only meant to be the shadow that allowed another to shine. And that realization did not just sting, it cut into the deepest parts of me, because I had trusted, I had believed, I had thought family was sacred, that fairness was inevitable, that after all I had endured, there would be balance, but instead I was left standing empty-handed, stripped of what should have been partly mine, and the bitterness that filled me was not only about wealth or property, it was about dignity, about recognition, about the value of my presence and my sacrifices being completely erased, as though I had been invisible the whole time, as though I had never mattered, and the cruelty of that realization pressed against my chest until I could hardly breathe, and in that suffocating silence I began to remember every small moment, every choice I had made for the sake of my family, every smile I had forced even when I was breaking inside, every time I told myself it would all be worth it, and I understood now that none of it had mattered, not to them, not to her, not to the cold legal document that sealed my fate, and that understanding changed something in me, something vital, because innocence once lost cannot be regained, trust once broken cannot be repaired, and in its place grows something far more dangerous, something sharper, something that does not bend to pity or excuses. And as I sat in the quiet aftermath of that revelation, my hands trembling though I tried to steady them, I knew I was not the same person I had been a moment before. I knew the wound that had been carved into me would not simply heal, it would fester, it would deepen, it would transform, and though I tried to calm the storm inside me, tried to whisper to myself that I could accept it, that I could move on, that I could let go, I knew deep down that moving on was no. The silent pain of being overlooked and dismissed is not something that bursts into your life all at once, it settles in slowly, like dust gathering on forgotten furniture, so gradual that at first you don't even notice it. You convince yourself that what you feel is small, that it will pass, but it doesn't pass. It lingers, it grows heavier, and before you know it, it becomes part of who you are, shaping the way you see yourself, shaping the way you move through the world. And in my life that pain had been there long before the day my sister inherited everything. It was there in the way I was always the one expected to give in, to compromise, to adjust, while she was the one excused, celebrated, placed on a pedestal for even the smallest efforts. And I swallowed that pain so many times that it became second nature. Every time my accomplishments were brushed aside with a quick nod while hers were met with applause, every time I was told to be the understanding one, the responsible one, the strong one, while she was allowed to be carefree, fragile, precious, and I convinced myself that it was fine, that my strength did not need recognition, that my sacrifices would speak for themselves one day, that patience would bring balance. But each time I thought balance was coming, it slipped away. Each time I thought my silence would be rewarded, I was reminded that silence only makes you easier to ignore, and the inheritance was just the sharpest confirmation of what had always been true, that in the eyes of those I loved, I had always been less, always been the one expected to endure without complaint, always been the shadow that made her light look brighter, and the ache of that realization cut deeper than any loss of property or money. It was the loss of worth, the denial of dignity, the cruel reminder that my devotion had been invisible all along. I remembered the countless nights I stayed awake tending to responsibilities no one else wanted, the mornings when I pushed myself through exhaustion because duty called, the celebrations where I stepped aside so she could be the center of attention, the moments I kept my mouth shut when I wanted to scream, all of it layered into years of silent service, all of it endured because I believed love meant sacrifice. But love without acknowledgement is not love, it is exploitation disguised in pretty words, and I had been living inside that disguise without realizing it, thinking my patience made me virtuous when in reality it made me invisible, and invisibility is a pain that eats away at you slowly, because the world sees your efforts but refuses to name them, and without a name, they fade, and you fade with them, and standing there after the inheritance was read, I felt the weight of every unnoticed gesture crashing down on me, years of swallowing words that burned in my throat, years of forcing smiles to cover the sting of being dismissed, years of telling myself that my time would come, that fairness would find me, that love would eventually balance the scales, but none of it had come true, none of it had saved me from this silence, and the betrayal I felt was not just in losing the inheritance, it was in realizing that I had been fooling myself all along, that I had been clinging to a false hope while everyone else had already written me into the background. The silent pain is cruel because no one else sees it. You become so good at hiding it that they mistake your endurance for contentment, they think your patience is proof that you don't need anything, that you don't want anything, that you can live without acknowledgement, and they let you carry that silence like a burden that grows heavier every year, and you never let it drop because you believe that dropping it will make you weak, but the truth is, carrying it makes you invisible, and invisibility robs you of Mo. I thought about the moments when I had wanted to be recognized, not with riches, not with titles, but with simple words, with a look of pride, with an embrace that said I was enough, and how those moments never came, how they were always given to her instead, and I told myself I was strong enough not to need them. But the truth is that everyone needs to be seen, everyone needs to be valued, everyone needs to feel that their presence makes a difference, and being denied that for so long had etched wounds into me that I pretended weren't there, but they were there every time I looked at her and wondered why she was chosen. Every time I asked myself what I lacked that made me unworthy, every time I swallowed down the urge to demand an answer, and those wounds deepened with the inheritance, because it was not just a matter of paper and signatures, it was a declaration, a final statement that confirmed what I had feared my whole life, that in the end, I did not matter the way she did. And in that moment of realization, the silence that had once been my shield became unbearable, it no longer felt like strength, it felt like chains. Chains I had clasped around myself believing they made me noble, but now I saw them for what they truly were, symbols of my dismissal, proof of my invisibility, and as I felt them pressing tighter I knew I could not keep carrying them, because the pain had grown too sharp, too alive, and though it was still silent, it had changed, it had shifted into something restless, something dangerous, something that could no longer be ignored, and in that shift I understood that pain like mine does not remain hidden forever, it grows, it pushes, it demands to be heard, and no matter how long I had endured it, no matter how well I had hidden it, the silence had finally reached its breaking point. The hidden truths buried within family history have a way of shaping lives in silence, working in the shadows while everyone continues believing in the P. The more I let my thoughts wander back, the more I uncovered moments that seemed insignificant then but now felt like clues, like the time I overheard my father and sister speaking late at night in the study, their voices low but urgent, and when I stepped in they both fell silent, exchanging a look that made me feel like an intruder in my own home, or the day I found my mother burning letters in the backyard, letters she claimed were just old bills, but I remembered the look in her eyes, a flicker of fear, as if I had almost caught a glimpse of something I was never meant to see, or the way the family lawyer always treated me with polite distance but spoke to my sister with warmth and familiarity, as if he already knew she would be the one holding the keys to everything. And I realized that all these little things were not coincidences, they were warnings, subtle signs that the truth was being hidden from me, buried beneath layers of lies and false reassurances, and I had been too trusting, too blind, too willing to accept what I was told without digging deeper. It struck me how family history is never as clean as it appears, How behind the smiles in photographs there are fractures, behind the laughter there are tensions, behind the stories told at dinner there are other stories left untold, darker ones, ones that reveal the cost of keeping the illusion intact. And in my family's history the cost had been me, my silence, my dismissal, my exclusion, and though it tore me apart to admit it, I began to understand that the inheritance was not the beginning of betrayal but the culmination of years of secrets that had been guarded fiercely, secrets that had shaped who was loved more openly, who was valued more visibly, who was destined to inherit everything while the other was left with nothing but questions. And I thought of how often families hide the ugliest truths to protect their image, to protect their favorites, to protect the lies they would rather live with than. The unraveling of lies that shaped the inheritance did not happen all at once. It began in small cracks, details that seemed insignificant but stuck in my mind like splinters, moments that made me pause and question what I had always accepted as unshakable truth. And the first crack appeared when I read through the documents myself, expecting a simple division, a fair recognition of what was owed to both of us, but instead I found layers of legal language, twisted in such a way that everything flowed into her name while mine was barely mentioned, as if I had been erased not only from the future but from the very story of the past. And the more I reread those pages, the more something inside me screamed that this was not just oversight or forgetfulness, this was deliberate, this was crafted. This was a web spun carefully over time until the moment it would catch me helplessly, and suddenly memories flooded back, moments when my father kept me away from discussions with the lawyer, moments when my mother's eyes carried a flicker of guilt but she said nothing, moments when my sister avoided my gaze as if she knew something I didn't, and all of these moments now fell into place like pieces of a puzzle I had never been allowed to see before. I started to dig deeper, to ask questions, to search through letters and old files that had been forgotten in dusty drawers, and with each piece I uncovered, the lies began to unravel, showing me that this was not a story of chance but a carefully built narrative, a narrative in which I was cast as the supporting character, the dutiful one who never demanded recognition, while she was cast as the heroine, the heir, the one who would carry everything forward. And the lies were not always spoken outright, they were crafted in subtler ways, in the way people spoke about her with pride and about me with expectation, in the way her mistakes were brushed away while mine were magnified, in the way the story of our family was told with her at. The lies shaped not only the inheritance but my identity. They had painted me as someone who did not deserve, someone who existed only to support, someone who was strong enough to endure but not important enough to receive, and I realized that I had accepted that role without knowing it, because lies repeated enough begin to seep into your own belief. And I had believed them. I had believed that maybe she deserved more, maybe I was destined to carry less, maybe my role was not to inherit but to stand aside. But when the lies began to unravel, I felt the anger of all those years rise in me, the anger of realizing that I had been manipulated into silence, that I had been trained to accept invisibility, that I had been molded into someone who would not fight back, and now that mold was cracking, breaking apart with every truth that spilled out. It was in the unraveling that I began to see patterns I had missed, like the way my sister always seemed confident in her place, never doubting that everything would fall to her, the way she carried herself not with hope but with certainty, as if she had known all along, and I wondered what promises had been whispered to her, what truths she had been told that were kept hidden from me, and the thought of her silence, her complicity, added another layer to the betrayal, because it was not just my parents, not just the lawyer, not just the relatives who stayed quiet. It was her too, the sister I had trusted, the sister I had shared my childhood with, the sister I believed would stand beside me, and she had stood silently while I lived in ignorance. She had let me believe in equality while she knew the script had already been written, and her silence was a lie just as cruel as any spoken word. The unraveling did not stop at the documents or the whispers of relatives, it seeped into my memories, making me question everything, every smile, every promise, every reassurance I had been given. And the more I questioned, the more I saw how deep the deception ran, how it was not just about inheritance but about control, about keeping me docile, about shaping me into someone who would not rebel when the truth was finally revealed. And I hated how well it had worked, I hated how completely I had been blinded, but with each layer that came undone, I felt something shift inside me, something that refused to stay blind any longer, something that refused to keep accepting the story I had been fed. The unraveling of lies is both painful and liberating, because each truth that emerges cuts deep, leaving scars that will never fade, but it also gives clarity. it also strips away the illusions that once held you prisoner, and as the lies that shaped the inheritance continued to crumble, I began to see not just the betrayal but the power it gave me, the power of knowing the truth, the power of finally understanding that I was never less deserving, that I was never invisible by nature, that invisibility had been forced upon me, crafted by the lies of others, and though the pain of that knowledge was unbearable, it was also the beginning of something new, something that could not be contained by their lies any longer. The transformation of hurt into strength and resolve is never an instant spark, it is a slow fire, one that starts in the ashes of disappointment, one that feeds on every betrayal, every dismissal, every hidden truth that cuts so deep you feel as if you might never recover, and at first it feels like drowning, like being swallowed by waves of pain that refuse to let you rise, but slowly, with every breath you fight to take, with every tear you allow yourself to shed in silence, something begins to change, something begins to harden and sharpen inside you. The transformation of hurt into strength is like the hardening of steel, fire and pressure combine to create something unbreakable, and my life had given me both fire and pressure in abundance. Every moment of being overlooked, every truth hidden from me, every betrayal I endured was another flame, another strike, another shaping of who I was becoming, and though it was agony in the moment, I began to feel the power in it, I began to feel the steadiness of resolve building in me, and I realized that I was no longer the same person who once accepted invisibility as her role. I was no longer the girl who thought silence was noble. I was becoming someone who understood that silence could be shattered, that invisibility could be broken, that hurt could be turned into a force that no one could dismiss again. With that realization came a clarity I had never known, a clarity that told me I was not weak for feeling pain, I was not foolish for having endured it, I was not worthless because others had tried to erase me, I was strong because I had carried hurt that would have destroyed others. I was strong because I had risen from betrayal that should have left me broken. I was strong because every scar I carried was proof that I had survived what was meant to silence me, and that survival was no longer just survival, it was transformation. It was the birth of resolve that would not rest until justice was found, until balance was restored, until the hurt that had once been my prison became the weapon that freed me, and in that freedom I found not just strength but a new sense of who I truly was, someone who could never again be overlooked, someone who could never again be dismissed, someone who had been forged in pain and risen unbreakable. The transformation of hurt into strength and resolve is never an instant spark, it is a slow fire, one that starts in the ashes of disappointment, one that feeds on every betrayal, every dismissal, every hidden truth that cuts so deep you feel. Every dismissal, every lie, every betrayal became fuel, and I began to draw from it. I began to see clearly that my pain was a reservoir of energy I had never tapped into, and instead of letting it weigh me down, I started to carry it like armor, letting it remind me that I had survived what should have broken me, letting it remind me that I was still standing even after everything had been taken, and that survival itself was strength, because those who tried to erase me had underestimated me. They had assumed that if they stripped me of inheritance, of recognition, of acknowledgement, I would fade quietly into the background, but they had not realized that they had created something they could no longer control. They had awakened a resolve in me that had been buried too long, and that resolve told me that I would no longer be silent, I would no longer accept invisibility, I would no longer measure my worth through the eyes of those who dismissed me. The transformation was not without struggle. There were nights when the hurt clawed at me, when the loneliness pressed in so tightly I could hardly breathe, when I wanted nothing more than to collapse under the weight of it all, but each time I faced those nights, I learned something new about myself. I learned that I could endure despair without letting it consume me, I learned that I could feel rage without letting it destroy me, I learned that I could stand in darkness and still find a spark within me, and those lessons became the foundation of my strength, because strength is not built in comfort, it is built in storms, it is built in nights when you have no one but yourself, it is built in the echoes of silence where you decide that you will not give up even if the world expects you to, and slowly I became someone different, someone who no longer bent under the weight of hurt but who used that weight to anchor herself, to steady herself, to sharpen her resolve. I began to see that the pain I had once thought of as the hurt I carried after being denied everything I thought I deserved was overwhelming. It filled me with a heaviness that seemed impossible to bear. I replayed every moment of sacrifice, every choice I had made for the sake of others, every time I had swallowed my pride and kept my voice silent, and those memories stabbed at me like reminders of my foolishness, but the more I let them circle in my mind, the more I began to see that my hurt was not weakness, my hurt was proof of my capacity to give, to love, to sacrifice, and if I could bear such pain without breaking, then I could also bear the fire it created inside me, and slowly I began to realize that the same endurance that once kept me silent could now be used as a weapon, that the patience I had carried for so long could transform into strategy, that the tears I had cried in secret could harden into steel within me, because strength does not always come from victories, sometimes it comes from the defeats that force you to rise differently, and I knew I was rising differently now. The moment revenge became the only justice left was not something I planned, it was not born in a single instant of anger or a fleeting desire to hurt back, it was a slow transformation, a layering of wounds and betrayals that left me standing in a place where forgiveness felt like weakness and silence felt like death. And for so long I had tried to convince myself that letting go was noble, that moving on was strength, that peace could be found by burying the pain deep enough so that no one, not even I, could touch it, but the truth was that the pain never stayed buried, it clawed its way up through the cracks of my days, through the quiet of my nights, through every memory that replayed uninvited, reminding me of what had been stolen, reminding me of how I had been erased, reminding me of how my sister's inheritance had not only taken material things but had also tried to take my very existence, and the more I lived in that shadow. The decision was not loud, it was quiet, it arrived in me like a storm that no one else could see, and yet it changed everything, because once I allowed myself to imagine revenge, I felt stronger, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, it was as if the weight I carried had finally found direction, as if the fire inside me that had once burned uncontrollably had now found a path to follow, and in that path I felt power return to me, the kind of power that had been stolen when I was dismissed. The kind of power that had been stripped from me when lies became inheritance, the kind of power that comes when you stop waiting for others to do right by you and decide to do right by yourself in the only way left. I began to see my sister differently, no longer as someone untouchable, no longer as someone who held all the cards, but as someone who had built her fortune on fragile lies, someone who had wrapped herself in false security, someone who believed betrayal had no consequence, and that realization fueled me. It gave me patience where I once had none, it gave me focus where I once felt scattered, it gave me control over my pain by transforming it into purpose, and with each day that passed I thought less about what I had lost and more about what I would take back, not in the same way, not through legal papers or family discussions or quiet pleas for fairness, but in a way that she would feel deep, in a way that would echo the pain she had caused me, in a way that would make her understand that nothing stolen stays safe forever. The idea of revenge reshaped me, it made me sharper, more observant, more deliberate, and I realized that for the first time I was no longer at the mercy of betrayal but was instead the architect of what would come next, and with that realization came a dark sort of freedom, a release from the helplessness that had haunted me for so long, because helplessness is what breaks you, not pain itself, but the feeling that you cannot change it, cannot. I stopped imagining revenge as something monstrous and instead began to see it as justice in its rawest form, stripped of illusions, stripped of politeness, stripped of the pretense that people who harm you deserve gentleness, and the more I accepted this, the more I understood that this was not about cruelty, this was about survival, this was about refusing to let betrayal be the story I carried to my last breath, this was about ensuring that those who thought they had won would learn that their victory was temporary, that their security was an illusion, that their betrayal was not without consequence. And as this understanding grew inside me, I felt myself transform, no longer the overlooked one, no longer the silenced one, no longer the shadow at the edge of the story, I became someone who would no longer accept injustice quietly, someone who would no longer bury pain and call it peace, someone who would no longer sacrifice my voice for the comfort of others. I became someone who embraced the fire, who welcomed it, who knew that sometimes destruction was the only path to renewal, and in that destruction I would find my own kind of justice, the kind that could not be taken from me again. So the moment revenge became the only justice left was not about anger alone, it was about reclaiming myself, it was about saying that betrayal would not define me but would instead sharpen me, it was about finally understanding that silence was not noble, forgiveness was not strength, and moving on without justice was not peace, it was surrender. And I had surrendered for too long, I had been quiet for too long, I had allowed myself to be erased for too long, and now all of that was over, now. Revenge was no longer just an option, it was the inevitable path forward, the only language left that could balance the scales, the only form of justice powerful enough to answer the betrayal that had once stolen everything from me.